may I congratulate all those who have spoken from the floor with typical Cambridge articulacy and also with the great virtue of terseness, which at this time of the evening is a great virtue indeed. Can I congratulate you for occupying a very distinguished seat? Some 36 years ago, it was occupied, I recollect, by a lady by the name of Ariana Stassinopoulos, and that goes to show that in 35 years' time, you too could be Queen of Cyberspace under the name of Ariana Huffington, which she now is. Congratulations too to the audience who've stayed with us and been relatively polite, certainly kept silent during speeches, which is a great virtue. Perhaps also congratulate you for your conservatism, because I could have entered this chamber all those years ago and found a not dissimilar disposition of attitudes and demeanour, which may say something about the very conservative nature of elite higher education, and it may say something about the fact that elite higher education is still supplied largely by people who have had elite forms of secondary education. I have two sins to expiate before I go on, very briefly. The first of these is that when I was an undergraduate at this university, I strove might and main to abolish this institution by establishing the Cambridge Students' Union, which institution that may or may not exist these days, but your existence proves that lack of success. So I apologise retrospectively for that. I need also to apologise for this very brief appearance before you of someone who, according to a certain former diarist, person of great distinction and perspicacity, called me boring. So for 5 minutes you will tolerate that. Could I, with your permission, just to check a piece of social data, ask the House if you would raise your hand if you were yourselves educated at a fee-paying secondary school?
On the point of information, I was, and the state paid my fees.
Yeah, exactly.
The point I was going to make was that your vote, of course, would be completely impartial when you come to it later on. But in fact, it seemed to me that proportion of hands roughly constitutes the 47%, which on average Oxford and Cambridge take in from fee-paying schools. So in that sense, the Union Society is not atypical of the university at large. I want to make two very brief points taken from the book Unjust Reward, so forgive me for plugging it. It's available at a discount from Amazon, published 2 months ago by Grantham. Private schools do inhibit social mobility in this sense. They block what should be the normal movement, not just upwards, but downwards. They allow parents, in a sense, a get-out-of-jail card for offspring who are often less than scintillating. Sociologists give us the phrase. Sociologists give us the phrase exchange mobility, by which they mean society necessarily is a bit like a game of snakes and ladders. A slot in the middle class or the upper reaches opens and it's filled hopefully by someone who clambers up the ladder on the back of their skills, their character, their personal attributes. The snakes take care of those who may be born to affluence but don't have character or ability. What private education does is stop the snakes operating, and to that extent they are a public nuisance. In a fluid society, the chances of people of different classes ending up in one class rather than another would be similar. They might go up, they might go down, there are all sorts of reasons for that. We hear all the time about the competitiveness, desirable competitiveness of markets. But these precepts don't seem to hold for society. We get upset when cartels fix prices, quite rightly, but the upper middle class's skill at erecting barriers to social fluidity, which is a similar kind of thing to the creation of a cartel, passes without opposition. John Goldthorpe, a distinguished sociologist of Nuffield College, Oxford, puts it like this: downward mobility must be promoted to exactly the same extent as upwards, because fluidity effects are by their nature symmetrical in a society which is genuinely open to opportunity and genuinely open to failure. Which one of you? Guy in the t-shirt.
Why isn't the private school's role to ease social mobility? Should it not be the government as well?
Sorry, say again.
You're saying that it's the private schools that are stopping social mobility, but why shouldn't it be the government?
Because they take in children of rich parents and equip them with access unfairly to positions in the upper reaches of the corporate sector, civil service and the national life at large. That's what they do, because they offer the attributes demonstrated by many of you here which impress admissions tutors.
But if the private schools weren't there, then there would be no school about that.
If the private schools... Sorry, I didn't catch...
If the private schools weren't there, the public schools wouldn't improve in quality, would they?
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you properly. If the
Private schools weren't there, the state schools wouldn't therefore improve in quality.
Well, that's a completely different argument which you've actually had very articulately addressed by my fellow speakers, so I'm not going to spend any time answering it. Let me make a second point, and this is based upon some evidence which, again, if you wish to see exposed in full, is in the book. You might justify private education if it had retained the moral integrity which public schools, as they once were, the deeds of trust of Eton College, demonstrated. But if, and I think there is some evidence for this, we have seen a collapse of ethical commitment in the City of London, if there are signs of nihilism, greed and moral collapse in the upper echelons of British business, where might you look, in theory, to attribute some responsibility for that? You would necessarily have to attribute some responsibility to the schools which educated disproportionately the people who end up at the top, for example, of FTSE 100 companies. Perhaps, may I go on, perhaps a sign of the public schools' own drop in ethical standards was the recent Office of Fair Trading disclosure that the top schools, Westminster included, were colluding to fix their fees, a dishonest and illegal practice. That their victims were predominantly the ultra-rich doesn't diminish the fact that they've clearly lost the moral plot. For the book, we interviewed the head of a school not many miles from here, the Perse. The motto of the Perse school, qui facit per alium facit per se. I'll leave you Latin scholars to translate that, but it demonstrates an historical commitment on the part of the ancient public schools to community. That commitment has almost completely disappeared on the evidence of the head of the Perse, on the evidence of private discussions at headmasters' conference meetings. He said to us, when we interviewed him for the book, it matters, the growing gap between rich and poor. I can see it storing up problems for children in the future. Here at the Perse, he said, the children have little inkling of where they stand in relation to others. They know they're academically successful, but they don't know they belong to a tiny elite. They're far